1. Carell looked down at the prisoner on the bunk. She smiled languidly, resting her shapely frame against the side of the door, which remained wide open. Beyond, the prisoner could catch a glimpse of the corridor, painted grey with white, red and green lines indicating routes to unseen destinations. No one moved along the walkways. No guards stood at the door. The room was in standard Federation prison format, painted grey with a single bunk, no chairs, no windows, and just enough room for the average man to walk up and down 6 paces at a time. The door was solid steel, doubly reinforced, grey like the rest of the room. When it closed, it moved easily along automatically oiled runners. It would continue to open and close noiselessly for 200 years, if anyone bothered to use it. "You never tried to escape," Carell stated. Her voice was calm and gentle, with a hint of deep knowledge. The prisoner continued lying on his back, staring impassively at the ceiling. Every 4 or 5 seconds his eyelids flickered, otherwise there was no perceptible movement beyond his slow, regular breathing. The silence was complete. The air in the room was fresh, refurbished from the outside through tiny filters built into the walls. It was all standard prison issue. All except Carell. She seemed prepared to wait all day for a reaction. Eventually, she was rewarded. The prisoner spoke. "The trap is too obvious," he said. "To run, you need somewhere to go. I don't seem to have that possibility at the moment." He paused. When Carell didn't reply, he added, "You have all the cards. You make the move." Carell retained her smile. Indeed, it was a continuous part of her makeup. But her eyes never moved from her prisoner. The man, she knew, had spent most of his time like this for the past 5 months. Twice a day, Carell disturbed him with food, followed by some rapid exercise up and down the corridor, then back into the cell for whatever conversation the prisoner would make. The routine had never varied. Most prisoners would have cracked long ago. The loneliness, the contradictions of a prison with only one warder, a door left unlocked during visits, the lack of knowledge. But something was keeping this man going. This prisoner was different. To the prisoner, Carell had been an unexpected and unknown visitor. Totally relaxed and self-confident, she seemed so sure of what she was doing that she always had the air of someone who could afford to wait forever. She had as long as the prisoner would take to give her orak. "Let's talk about you," announced Carell after another long pause. The prisoner levered himself up and sat on the side of his bunk, but said nothing. "You've had no thoughts of escape for 5 months, because for only the second time in your life, you were looking inwards." It was a diagnosis, not a question. Carell grinned, a grin imposed on top of a smile. She paused again, watching her prisoner intently. She sensed, rather than saw, a movement, a suggestion that this was the right track. Encouraged, she continued. "For years you have been living on a knife edge, just avoiding death. The pressure has been constant. You could have stood all that if it hadn't been for some memories. They keep flooding back. You live with the memory of the people you trusted, the only people you trusted in your entire life. They betrayed you." The meanings were harsh, but the words seemed soft. The prisoner looked up. "People?" he asked mildly. Carell's speech was having an effect. "You loved the girl. You nearly died for her. And she was an agent of Servalan." Another pause. The prisoner lay back down. Vitality seemed to drain from his face minute by minute. "And the man Blake. You pretended to despise him, but you admired his purpose." "Blake," was a fool. But you thought you knew him. You thought you could predict him. In the end, you couldn't be sure. Did Blake betray you? It seemed like a real question. The prisoner allowed himself a brief smile. It's a good story, he told Carell. And true? For once, Carell's response seemed a little too fast. More or less. What do you want? There's no hurry, Carell announced. We'll talk tomorrow. I'd like to tell you now, replied the prisoner. His voice was fragile. Tomorrow, Carell repeated, and turned her back on her captive. The gentle hiss indicated that the door was locked. The prisoner lay on his bunk, a faint smile still on his face. Months before, he had checked and double-checked the room for watching devices, but there were none. Prisoners on Gouda Prime had obviously been run-of-the-mill murderers who didn't need watching. His face would not be seen. He knew he now had little time left to wait. His move must come with Carell's next visit, when his jailer thought him to be at his weakest. Until her return, he could do nothing but wait. That was no problem. He had had a lot of practice recently. He closed his eyes and rethought his campaign. 1 hour later, his reverie was broken by a sound outside. A flash of annoyance crossed the prisoner's face. He had misjudged Carell. He had been sure that his jailer would insist on waiting until the morning to make him finally submit. An early start meant that Carell was less confident than he had supposed. In time-honoured tradition, the prisoner pressed himself against the wall next to the sliding door and waited. As the door opened, he allowed his surprise to register for just a split second before hitting not Carell, but a Federation guard. In that brief moment, he diverted his blow to the kidneys rather than the side of the neck, as he had planned, merely bringing the guard to the floor rather than rendering him unconscious. Guards, although not bright, did tend to know if there were others like themselves around. With a vicious twist, he brought his arm under the guard's neck and pushed a fist into his back. To the guard, it could have been any one of a variety of weapons. The wrong type of movement on your part could lead to serious consequences, the prisoner announced quietly. Just take your helmet off slowly. It would be helpful if we could have a talk. As he spoke, he dragged the guard away from the door and touched the plate to its side to close it. The guard certainly didn't seem to want to offend the prisoner with any rapid movements at all. He was quivering in his all-black uniform, which upon closer inspection appeared to be completely the wrong size. Gently, the helmet was removed, and the prisoner found himself looking at the back of a head that he knew rather well. Villa, he announced simply. Villa didn't turn for the simple reason that he was petrified. He would know the voice of Avon anywhere. During their last few months together, Avon had tried to sacrifice Villa in order to save his own skin, and towards the end, Villa had gained the distinct impression that Avon was investigating the possibilities of rapidly ridding himself of the whole of his crew. If Avon had turned into a homicidal maniac, Villa didn't particularly want to get in his way. Recognizing Villa's problem, Avon let go his grip and allowed the thief to fall to the floor. Villa crawled a few feet and turned to look up in dismay. The short-cropped hair had grown longer, and the weak chin revealed a few days' growth of beard, but otherwise Villa looked much the same. "I think you ought to try to be a bit nicer to someone who has just rescued you from prison," he said. "It was rather hard to tell who you were inside that uniform," Avon replied. "Although I should have realized it was you. You don't quite have that aggressive authority which is the hallmark of the average Federation thug. However, there are a number of locks you could open between here and the outside world, and I rather suspect the average guard wouldn't be able to open them quite as quickly as you." Villa looked annoyed. "Quite as quickly?" he demanded. What do you mean quite as quickly? I can open locks in seconds which take the manufacturers 4 weeks, and that's when they have the key. But Avon had already tired of the thief's bravado. I don't want a race, he said. Just escape. Villa got up and turned to Avon with a flash of professional pride. No problem. It's all done. You can walk straight out of here into the outside world, which, I might tell you, is saturated since this is the rainy season. And rainy season means rain. Non-stop, endless. Thank you for the weather report. Now, can we get out without bumping into a single Federation guard? In fact, without bumping into anyone. You aren't going to tell me you killed them all, demanded Avon, warily stepping to the lock mechanism and opening it once more. No, not exactly. Good. Because your abilities as a liar are far below those you possess as a thief. But I did open the main hatch. The place is deserted. Not one single regular spaceship has taken off or landed during the past 4 months, and only a couple of flyers have come and gone in all the time since you invoked universal mayhem. And now there's not a single guard on the base. What did you do to them, Avon? Threatened to give a lecture to the assembled multitudes on the subject of your ego. Looking out from his cell in order to check on the thief's claims, Avon ignored the jibes. The corridor led away left and right, ending both ways in simple T-junctions, with no indication of what lay beyond. Sadly for Avon, these initial attempts at exploration failed to stop Villa's boasting. I thought it was about time I came in and saw what was going on, he said nonchalantly. And, of course, I was looking for a way of rescuing the others. But you didn't find them? No. Not surprising after 5 months. What were you doing out there, Villa? Counting the trees? With that, Avon slowly led the way out of the cell and along the passageway. He chose the left corridor, turning left at the junction and left again 20 yards further on. He could have asked Villa for directions, but he preferred to trust more to his own judgment and analysis. The control room would be at the centre of the base. These manoeuvres ought to get them there. If the route was different from Villa's, so much the better. For anyone relying on Villa and Avon's return by the same route would be disappointed. Still desperate to prove his worth, and rapidly realizing that Avon had become the first viable way of getting off Gouda Prime that had offered itself in the past 5 months, Villa tagged along behind, trying hard to make the most of history. You didn't expect me to rush straight in, did you? I had to get a good picture of the area, watch out for troop cover. That's why I took the uniform. The story wasn't impressing Avon. It was also clear from the way he was holding his hands Avon was feeling the lack of a weapon, and in that respect Villa was unable to help. He knew of Avon's good nose for danger, and his caution made Villa feel more nervous than he really wanted to feel. Walking through the short corridors, he began to wonder if the near starvation he had endured outside the settlement dome these last 5 months had been worth it. Maybe he should have stayed in the rain. Another week, and he'd have had no more worries. Suddenly, the corridors ended. The main control room appeared ahead of them. It was circular and spacious, the control desks and panels ringed by a raised walkway. Functional pillars supported the roof. Chairs were set behind the desks. The blood and the bodies had gone. Otherwise, it was as Avon remembered it. Avon, said Villa, gloomily casting his eyes around the all-too-familiar scene. What happened? Avon looked around with an annoyed expression. Villa, I am grateful to you for unlocking the cell door for me, but my gratitude does not extend to standing around in wide open spaces waiting for someone to attack while you question me at the top of your voice. He moved off quickly, looking down each of the 3 corridors in turn that fed into the room. Villa started to follow, realized what Avon was doing, and then stood resolutely in the centre of the circle, refusing to be appeased. Relax, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. There's nobody here. I know because I've been out and about while you've been sitting in your cell playing patience. Correction, said Avon tersely. I have been held prisoner, whilst you, I suspect, have been drinking every drop of adrenaline and soma within 20 miles. Avon decided to move off down a passageway opposite to that from which they entered. Seeing that this was more than just another tactical investigation, Villa ran to catch Avon up, but still reached the main door a little behind. Its green frame slanting inwards to match the curvature of the dome had been slid to one side, and rain was splashing in. Avon looked cautiously out into the downpour. "I told you it was raining," said Villa obviously. "You don't want to go out there." He looked out. Through the rain and mist, it was just possible to make out endless rows of trees, fast-growing hardwoods which put all their energy into thrusting up into the sky rather than producing leaves. The rain thus poured straight down onto the soil. The resultant mud was bound heavily to the intertwined roots. Deep, dark brown rivers ran between the rows. Avon looked, but made no reply. Villa continued the monologue. "There's no one out there. There is no one else in here, and I would still like to know what's happening, or, failing that, what is going to happen, or, failing that," he ended plaintively, "anything at all." Relaxing slightly, apparently satisfied that they were not being overlooked, Avon turned back to Villa. "You are sure you've seen no one at all?" "For about 4 months, it's been like I told you." Villa was getting exasperated. "No people, no guards, no Federation, no ships, and," he added as his stomach gave a twinge, "no food." "What about the tall girl, long fair hair swept over to one side, civilian clothes, calls herself Carell?" "Pretty?" Despite himself, Avon smiled. "Yes," he said simply. The answer didn't seem to please Villa. In fact, it made him more depressed than he already was. He said, "Oh," and then said no more, but looked wistfully at the rain and the mud. He got to starve in a beaten-up freighter for 5 months, he thought, whilst Avon got to be interrogated by a beautiful woman. That was what life seemed to be all about. He contemplated not speaking at all for the next week. Then he spoke. "The answer is still no. The base is deserted." Villa paused. The novelty of having someone to talk to was definitely beginning to wear off. At that moment, there was a crack from the trees beyond the main hatch. "Down!" snapped Avon. Despite all his previous assurances, Villa did not need telling. He was already on the floor, lying in a pool of water with drips from the roof of the hatch falling on the back of his neck as he held his breath. Avon looked out carefully, but could see no sign of life. "Probably just one of the animals," observed Villa, trying to give himself back some confidence. "They always come out in the rain." Avon relaxed once more. "How did you escape?" "I was never captured," Villa replied. "Instant reflexes." "You mean, as the firing began, you hit the deck?" "Something like that. No point hanging around being heroic. Not twice in one day." "And the others? Tarrant, Dana, Sulin?" "Do you mean you care? I got the impression you wanted us all dead." Villa looked at Avon, trying to read his thoughts. An impossible task. He answered the question. "No idea. When I looked up, you had been marched out and the others were still on the ground. I crawled into an empty cupboard and waited. By the time I came out, everyone had gone. I made for the outside, got wet, and let myself into the nearest spaceship. That was the last I saw of anybody until you grabbed me by the throat. One of the other freighters took off from the other side of the clearing just after I got into the ship. But that was about it. Apart from the ship that landed." Avon looked around sharply. "Describe it," he commanded. "I didn't really see it," Villa said. "It came in on the other side of the dome, but from over here, through all the rain, it looked—" He paused as if he didn't believe it himself. "It looked round, sort of like a sphere, and it was huge. It was down for about an hour, and then took off again." The flyers could have been Tarrant and the rest, or they could have been guards. Avon made no further acknowledgement of Villa's information. If he recognised that Villa was, at least for the time being, holding him personally responsible for the presumed deaths of the entire crew of Scorpio, save themselves, he certainly did not show it as he stepped out into the rain. Avon made straight for the nearest of the 3 small space freighters docked close to the settlement. They were small enough to come down in the clearing without special landing bays. They stood upright, traditional nose cones pointing to the skies awaiting the next takeoff. Around the cones were the ramjet intakes, breathers as they were commonly known, pulling in hydrogen for the fusion units at the heart of each ship of this class. At the base were the 2 entry doors, one small for the crew, one about 10 times larger for the freight. In one case, the loading ramp was down, although the freight door appeared tightly closed. All around the area, the ground had been severely burned by the reverse thrust of the fusion jets as the ships had landed. The burning had made the ground solid. The water lay in deep pools, looking for somewhere to run to. Avon splashed through and took cover from the rain by the overhanging ledge above the main entry hatch. Villa ran more slowly and got wetter. As he had discovered 5 months ago, his boots leaked. "Just open the hatch," commanded Avon. Villa tried to act with a superiority he didn't entirely feel. He had unlocked the hatch when he had first hidden in the ship, and had left it that way. One touch on the pressure point, and the door slid back. The muddy footprints he had left there during his last visit were still all over the floor. Avon wasn't impressed. "Why didn't you leave a sign up in case you weren't noticed?" he hissed, with what Villa took to be unnecessary aggravation. "Stay here, out of sight." "Out of sight? You can't seriously be expecting trouble. Not here. From what?" Villa moved backwards into the entry bay and took cover. "There's nothing out there, Avon." He ducked down, scared despite his protestations, as Avon moved away towards the plantations. Villa did not miss the irony of the situation. How many times in the past 5 years had he been in this sort of position, acting as lookout on one of Avon's schemes, without even knowing what the scheme was, or even where Avon was going? Did nothing ever change in this galaxy? Avon ran quickly but carefully through the downpour, the trees clumped closely together, towering overhead. Whatever it was in the local soil that made the trees grow fast and tall also inhibited the growth of virtually all the vegetation. The paths between the trees were clear of everything except mud. With no gun in his hand, Avon hoped Villa's analysis of the situation, never trustworthy at the best of times, was correct. After 5 minutes he found what he was looking for. One particular tree with a couple of scratch marks on its side. He counted his way past 7 more trees, turned and counted a further 3, then again 7, and finally 4. He looked down. There was a small depression in the ground that shouldn't have been there. Avon pulled the muddy soil away with his bare hands, but to no avail. He knew what he sought was gone. Retracing his steps, Avon felt he had few tricks left to play. After weathering 5 months of psychological warfare, Villa had blundered in. Aurak had been Avon's one chance of escape from the planet, and Carell must have known all the time. Now he was back to improvisation. He had no lack of faith in his own ability to resolve any situation in his own favour, but like Villa he wondered, if only for a second, when anything was going to change. Back at the ship, Villa heard a movement. It came from behind him, inside the freighter which he was so certain was empty. He cursed himself. Avon was right as ever. Leaving the hatch unlocked had been stupid. Anxious to try and avoid further problems, he moved back a few paces, slipped on the edge of the entry bay floor, and went tumbling backwards down the ramp into the mud outside. only to find himself looking up at a tall, elegant, smiling lady with long blonde hair pulled over to one side of her face, standing inside the ship. By the time Avon returned, Villa had gone. Looking down at the muddy footprints on the entry ramp, he knew what to expect, but could think of nothing that would put himself in a more positive position apart from walking into the situation. With a mental shrug of the shoulders, he entered the ship and made his way cautiously through the freight hold and up the vertical stairways towards the flight deck. The central control area, like the rest of the ship, was functional and compact. 3 sets of control panels were set at desks designed to be operated by the pilot, navigator, and captain. The desks were lined up beside each other, so each officer could see the master screen and the ship computer ahead of them. Villa was sitting in the pilot's chair, his feet on the control panel in front of him, a bottle of liquid nutrients to his lips. Inevitably, seated next to him, was Carell, gently swinging left and right. "Come and sit down, Avon," said the woman. "After all these months, I'm not going to pose a threat to you now." Carell spoke in her usual relaxed manner. Only her clothes had changed. She was in a practical one-piece flying suit. The trousers were tucked into her boots. The boots were covered in mud. "You might not," said Avon, surveying the flight deck, "but I might just pose a threat to you." "Not without a gun, Avon." Carell was still sitting, still smiling. "You are pretending to be stupider than you really are. It must be the company I keep. It drags the mentality down being in prison." Carell opened negotiations. "I have Aurak and the key, and you have the code system to get Aurak to work again." "How did you get to the machine?" "I found Aurak because I know a lot about your brain. Your belief in yourself has always been your major strength, Avon, but it does leave you vulnerable to anyone with time to find out all about you. If you knew how much data I'd accumulated on you, you might have been more guarded in what you said, and what you didn't say. You were working for the Federation. For a while, yes. But all they are interested in is brute force and destruction on a planetary scale. They've lost interest in the finer points of the human technology." "So, an applied social technologist turning your work to practical usage," said Avon. "One of the best," replied Carell, in her most relaxed way. "Not the best?" asked Avon. It was a strange question for him, hinting at sarcasm which was not part of his normal repertoire. Villa stopped drinking for a moment to consider it, but quickly set the matter aside. To Carell the meaning was plainer, but she refused to give Avon the information he was seeking. Villa made an effort to get his brain into some sort of working order. "If you are involved in human technology, you can read my mind." "That shouldn't take long," said Avon. Carell ignored the comments. "Everyone has certain numbers logged in the subconscious," she said to Avon. "Numbers such as 7473. 7473, repeated Villa. It seemed meaningless. "It was the number of the apartment that Anna and I shared," admitted Avon simply. He showed no emotion, but inside was annoyed with himself. He knew he had not told Carell about that number. How had she found it without access to Aurak? And more importantly, how had he, Avon, been so utterly stupid as to overlook the connection? Carell, he realized, was going to be an enemy worthy of him. "I can't debug Aurak without Aurak and the key," said Avon, sitting down in the third chair. Villa now found himself between the two protagonists. "There you are," Carell replied, nodding towards a bulkhead in front of the freighter's own master computer complex, where the transparent box was placed. A couple of lights shone inside, but the machine was silent. "All yours." Aurak, inert, looked like nothing more than a transparent plastic container of crossing wires, control panels, and Carell cells. It measured about 2 feet across by 1 foot wide, and was light enough for a man to carry by the handles at either end. Villa had often described it as nothing more than a pile of old junk, and at this moment it looked like it. Avon moved across the deck and began working carefully, his face taut. The slight frown on his forehead was barely distinguishable, and yet, despite his growing nutrient and soma haze, Villa saw Avon was seriously troubled. Avon was never an all-action fighter. He knew perfectly well when his own best interests were served by doing nothing, or even at times running away. But here he seemed to be showing real signs of puzzlement, possibly even defeat. The old look of a man who, even if he didn't have all the answers, knew that no one else would work them out faster than he could, had gone. And that was odd, because no matter what sort of fix Avon was in, he would always believe that his inherent abilities would get him out. Villa was unsure what to say. Seemed a fair start. Shut up, came the reply. That, at least, was the Avon of old. Villa shut up. Avon continued to work methodically. After 10 minutes, a gentle hum could be heard. After 12, Orac's rotating lights came back to life. And on 15 minutes, a familiar, irritated, impatient voice returned. What is it now? The computer demanded. You are needed, Avon replied. Will Orac respond to my commands? Asked Carell. Why shouldn't it? Because he has a will of his own. You are well informed, but he is it. Orac is a machine. Will Orac respond to me as much as to you? Carell persisted. Tell me if there are programs you have implanted in the machine that will hinder my use of it. There are no programs. It all depends on Orac. Why don't you ask? Avon's voice was clipped. Because if it is not telling me the truth, then it probably will not answer that question honestly either. So now you just have to trust me and Orac. But you knew that all the time anyway. When Ensor made Orac, he programmed it with his own personality and thirst for obscure knowledge, the sort of knowledge that Ensor never really had time to develop until he settled on Aristo, and by then he was getting old. Requests for information from us tend to get in the way of Orac's studies. Carell turned to the machine. We are on board a Mode 12 freighter transporter. It has a low-grade fusion drive capable of time distort 4 only. It has not teleport facilities. I know all that, interrupted Orac. Kindly state your business and allow me to get back to more pressing matters. Avon allowed himself a slight smile, but Carell's incessant calm was unruffled. Orac, I wish to transform this craft into a deep space cruiser capable of at least time distort 12, and preferably time distort 16, with a teleport facility which can operate over 2,000 spatials. I want defense mechanisms capable of withstanding plasma attack. You know what facilities are on the base outside. We can use all those. Physically, there are just the 3 of us, plus the 4 service robots in the plantation center. We also have access to 2 flyers grounded on the far side of the center. Is it feasible? Orac answered at once. No. Why not? Because you will need a supply of signum crystals for the plasma shield, and a small number of radiation direction finders for the teleport, which you do not have on the base, and cannot build with the various raw materials which you have at your disposal. And there is one further problem. Yes, Carell showed no disappointment. It was as if she had expected the answer. Even if you had those materials, it would still take the 3 of you halfway into the 3rd century of the new calendar to build the equipment. You would all be dead, although, when that joyous time comes, I will at least be allowed to proceed with my inquiries in peace. Carell was not to be put off. We need these modifications to this or another suitable craft within 3 weeks. Is there a strategy that we could follow? Yes, but it would be highly hazardous. Villa groaned and sank further into his chair. The others ignored him. By using some of the parts on the base, you can, under my guidance, modify the base androids to work on this craft and give it time-distort facility to the level you require. However, to obtain the other parts for the rest of your modifications, you will have to travel to a deep space repair port and procure certain items. The nearest port is a space station in orbit around the planet Ferron in the 3rd sector. But once we reach the Ferron station, we shall have to remove the parts we need without the use of teleport and travel without plasma protection. That is logically correct, and barely worth stating, if I may say so. That's right, Aurak, you tell them, said Villa from his corner. Avon removed the switch from Aurak and turned to Carell. Satisfied? He demanded. Perfectly. Now, if you'll be kind enough to get Aurak to tell us exactly what we need, Villa and I will go and work with the androids. Villa. Work. All my life, sighed Villa, there has been work. I keep telling people that stealing is better, but they still want work. This work is theft, said Carell patiently, as she led the reluctant thief out. Avon, collect the initial instructions and then come to G9 corridor. Villa will open up the androids so you can reprogram them. Avon nodded. Immediately he heard the main door close behind them. He turned to Aurak and reinserted the key. What is your problem? He asked the machine. To what do you refer? Replied Aurak, with the superior air he had inherited from his creator. Skip the mind games, Aurak. I don't have time, Avon told him. Is it mind? Machine-induced neural deviance is a concept and cannot be logically used in relation to the question, what is your problem? Besides, mind is a theoretical construct of unproven base. No one has demonstrated that it is possible to make individuals deviate from their normal course of actions through machine codes. Apart, that is, from the crudest call signs which induce individuals to return to particular locations, and those require pre-programming. Indeed, to interrupt the seemingly endless flow, Avon removed the key with a flourish of his right hand. He paused for a moment, and then reinserted the key. Let's try again, Aurak. You are suffering some sort of interference. Could that interference be mind? Aurak was not to be so easily deflected. Since I do not recognize that machine-induced neural deviance exists, the answer must logically be no. But there is another machine. It appears to be unreadable by me. I have endeavored to establish contact on a number of occasions, but without success. Is it a computational device? That is as it appears, and yet if it were a computer, then it would be readable by myself. Therefore, since I cannot read it, it logically cannot be an instrument of computation. What function does it perform? I do not have that information. Where is it situated? I do not have that information, although it appears to be close by. Now, if you will allow me to continue with my work, there are many problems relating to this part of the galaxy which need investigation. Forget that, Aurak. I want to know about the mechanism you cannot read. I want to know where it is, what it is, and who, if anyone, controls it. And I want to know if it could just conceivably be the first example of machine-induced neural deviance that you have come across. That, of course, was one of the matters to which I was referring, Aurak announced. You knew, as soon as you initiated the reprogramming, that there was a central logical problem facing me. Therefore, interrupted Avon, get on and solve it. But Aurak was not to be told what to do. Therefore, the machine replied, emphasizing the word, do not instruct me to undertake tasks which you know perfectly well I am already investigating. It is a prime example of the way in which DNA-based organic life forms waste the time of entities such as myself. Really, Avon, your mind must have degenerated during your spell in the dome, and I did have hopes for you. You should devote yourself to a course in logical training. The educational section of the dome computers should be able to provide suitable material. Thank you, Aurak. I'll bear your advice in mind. But before you get back to your esoteric studies, we'll need the details of how to get this ship to travel through space. First, improve the ship's computer so that it will take rapid information from me. That will liberate me from the task of having to listen to you, Avon. Enlarge the memory function in Gate 19 and introduce a voice synthesizer. You should be able to design it. Then we should get what we want. Inside the plantation dome, Villa pondered the prone form of one of the service androids. The machine was box-like, running on 8 wheels with 10 separate highly extendable arms located around the edges. Its white, shiny surface contained a number of contact points just below a central brain section located in the top of the box. Villa had succeeded in bypassing the primary feeds, which acted as a locking mechanism to the robot's brain. What he couldn't do, and indeed wasn't expected to do by either Carell or Avon, was to start reprogramming the machine to accept his orders. On the other hand, Villa fancied a tame android for himself. The simple fact of lack of knowledge had never stopped him in the past, and seemed unlikely to now. He lowered a lance into the brain, and nearly dropped when a voice spoke quietly from behind. 1 centimetre lower, and the backup circuits will discharge through you. Villa didn't need to be told twice. He leapt backwards and collapsed onto the floor. "Where is Carell?" asked Avon, whose voice it was. "Somewhere through there," Villa indicated with a vague wave of the hand to the rest of the dome. "I had instructions to open up the brains of these mobile boxes for you to do your reprogramming bit. Just make sure they respond to the orders of all 3 of us. Carell specifically included me." Avon knelt down and inspected the android. It looked like a straightforward job. He turned to Villa. "Go back to the ship and open up every locked compartment you can find. Check inside for anything other than the onboard control systems that might be computer-based. Also, open up the safety locks on all the onboard computers so I can get inside them." "Wonderful," said Villa, not moving. "You're going to disable the ship we are leaving in so that it runs out of control with all of us on board. A brilliant scheme. I should have thought of it myself." "If that was the scheme, you would have thought of it yourself." "Listen, if you want to commit suicide, that's fine, but don't involve me. Hasn't it struck you that Carell is getting us off this soaking planet? She hasn't attacked us, killed us, threatened us, or anything us. In fact, I don't see how she could threaten us even if she wanted to. So what are you doing fooling around with the ship's gear?" Avon decided to humour the thief. He spoke rapidly in a low voice. "Villa, 5 months ago this area was crawling with Federation troops. Now it isn't. A number of people, or possibly their bodies which were here, are no longer here. Somewhere close by there is a computer that Aurak cannot read. The only person who conceivably knows what is going on is Carell. Since she is unlikely to tell us the answers, I want to know where the other computer is and what it is. If things go wrong, Aurak is our only friend, and I don't want Aurak being intercepted by something we know nothing about. There is a fair chance that whatever it is that Aurak cannot read is on the ship, so our job, your job, is to find it." Villa got up resignedly. "All right, Avon, yes, Avon, I'm going, Avon, at once, Avon." He repeated the phrases over and over as he made his way back to the entry hatch. His intention was to go inside, sit down, and do none of the things Avon had asked of him. But it was raining again, so he ran quickly into the ship to get dry. Finding himself on board and alone, he turned back to the one thing he could do, the one thing that made him Villa, and started opening the locked doors.